Hey everybody, this is Nico, and welcome back to another episode of the Learning and Labor podcast. Today we have a guest to talk about what everyone's really been thinking about over the last month, which is the 2024 presidential election, and not just the presidential election, the 2024 election in the United States as a whole. With our guest today, Talik, we're going to talk about what might have caused Trump's victory in this election.
Well, Donald Trump has had something that very few Republicans before him have had consistently: white working class support.
And we're going to talk about what might happen next.
I don't think the DOGE or whatever the hell it's called is going to actually do anything.
So let's go ahead and get right into it and run the intro.
It therefore seems to me most important that you, the people of the state of Illinois, should know your university. Is it doing what you want it to do as the people's university? You are the owners, and your decision is final. Learning and labor. For the people and by the people. The people's university.
I guess first I just want to thank you for coming on. And I guess to start off with, I just wanted to ask you to introduce yourself, share your name, pronouns if you would like, and just maybe talk a little bit about what your connection is to the Midwest.
Cool. Well, I'm Talik Taylor, and you see him his pronouns. I'm a student at the University of Illinois. I'm a senior. I study creative writing. I have a Substack where I write a lot of things about theology and politics, or a mixture of the two. Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest. I've lived here my whole life. I grew up in the city of Chicago. I grew up on the west side. I grew up in the Lawndale neighborhood. I moved over to the Austin neighborhood when I was about 9 years old. And then my parents and I moved to the suburbs when I was in high school. But I still went to high school in the city. So from 0 to 18, I was in Chicago for school. Yeah, so I've been in the Midwest my whole life.
Cool. And I guess kind of to jump right into that, today we're talking about the election. And I think a big question everyone's asking themselves, across the country, but in the Midwest as well, is what do you think are the main reasons for, Trump's victory in these Midwestern swing states that were so important for this election, and just overall his gain in support across the region?
Well, Donald Trump has had something that very few Republicans before him have had consistently, with Ronald Reagan probably as the exception: consistent white working class support. George W. Bush did not have that when he was president. His coalition actually looked a little bit closer in terms of suburban white support to the Democratic parties now. But at that time, there were still vestiges of sort of the New Deal era Democratic Party. Clinton was a huge departure from that, but Clinton was able to win white working class voters as well in the 90s. And so in the 2000s, the Democratic Party still has vestiges of a New Deal coalition, even though President Clinton moved the Democratic Party to the right. He was still able to court working class voters, as was Al Gore, as was John Kerry, as was Barack Obama in both of his elections. In 2016, with Donald Trump, that erodes. By that point, the Democratic Party has firmly completed sort of its distance from at least white working class voters. It still has the base of the party are still black working class voters, and even in 2016, Latino working class voters. I believe Hillary Clinton carried the Latino vote by about 30 points. So a little bit lower than Barack Obama, but certainly not as low as Kamala Harris did. Trump's appeal to white working class voters has been the subject of many, obviously, books and articles and opinion pieces here and there written by very wealthy New York liberal types, or very overpaid Atlantic writers, or, very well-educated professors. But I think it's a real simple reason why Donald Trump appeals to working class voters, and it's twofold. One is that his racism is appealing. And one of the reasons why the Republican Party tried the Southern strategy in the late 1960s, early 70s under Nixon is because they realized that racism, and particularly anti-black racism, was an appealing idea. They realized that the Democratic Party wasn't competitive, at least as competitive in the South, or rather, I should say, the Democratic Party wasn't as dominant. They weren't as much of a shoo-in in the South as they had been for generations, because the Democratic Party, had shifted left on race. particularly with civil rights and voting rights, and later fair housing in 1968. And so Nixon and the Republican Party realized that the South is now swing. It's up for grabs. It's not firmly Republican yet until much later, until maybe the mid-2000s, but it's still competitive, and it's competitive largely because of racism. And so that appeal has not died out. There are still very large portions of the country, large portions of the white working class, that believe that people of color are to blame for their economic dispossession. So that's one thing. The second thing, and this is why he appeals to people of color, not just white working class people, but even some Latino Americans. Many Latino Americans, especially in this election, about 44% of them, is because Donald Trump positions himself publicly as a populist. He is, in many ways, his public-facing persona is very unconventional for a politician. And for a country where working class people of all races have sort of been trampled over to varying degrees and in various different ways by a very wealthy, a very concentrated professional and ruling class, Donald Trump's unprofessional behavior can appear relatable even to voters who don't have any class commonalities with a person as wealthy as Donald Trump. The fact that he says what's on his mind, voters will say that a whole lot. Now, obviously, what is on his mind is completely insane, doesn't really make any sense, is incoherent 90% of the time, and when he actually does policies, he's a right-wing autocrat. And, a massive, massive benefit to the wealthiest people in the country who have rigged the economy in their favor. Donald Trump enacts no populist policies, but he appears populist. And the Democratic Party just hasn't really embraced populism. It's not really their vibe these days. They are a professional managerial class party. Lawyers, doctors, civil servants. None of the demographics are monolithic by any means. But they do illustrate that the Democratic Party's sort of class orientation is shifting. Joe Biden's coalition in 2020 was the widest coalition for a Democratic president to win in many years. Democrats had normally leaned on people of color and white working class voters because they didn't really expect to get a whole lot of white suburban voters to vote for them. But the reason why Joe Biden was able to make it within 6 points in a state like Texas, where Donald Trump made gains with Latino voters in 2020, was because of Denton, Tarrant County, right? The suburban, white, college-educated counties. He didn't win them, but he was able to make it a little bit more competitive. And so that's what the Democratic Party has shifted to. It is still, by all means, a multiracial party. African Americans make up a huge core base of it. Even a majority of Latinos, a falling majority, but still a majority of Latinos vote Democratic. A majority of Asians, again, falling majority, vote Democratic. But it does have a lot more whiter, wealthier people in it. And I think that explains Donald Trump's appeal to white working class voters who live in lower income suburbs of larger cities or in rural areas, where economic mobility that existed maybe 80, 90 years ago is totally gone now because of a whole host of factors, technological advancement being one factor, but another being that there are really no coherent redistributive policies that have been enacted on a consistent basis to sort of alleviate the concerns of those voters, poverty, drug addiction, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a really good explanation of kind of the demographic shifts that have happened within the two-party system over the last several decades, dating back from like the, previous realignment that happened in the Southern strategy. I guess I feel like it's very much summed up by the infamous now Chuck Schumer quote.
For every blue-collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2, 3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin.
I guess you could see Joe Biden's victory as a successful, enactment of that policy. But obviously 2016 and 2024 make it look much more like a failure in terms of, winning elections, never mind actually like improving people's lives, which is I think a separate question. But I guess what I'm interested in then is your perspective on why that, maybe succeeded in 2020 and then why 2016 and 2024, obviously it went the other way. What were the main differing factors that you saw between, the last few elections beyond just this kind of like broader demographic shift, or, maybe why that was more impactful in one or the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, 2016 and 2024 are very different elections. Very, very different. The comparison being made is pretty upfront and pretty obvious, kind of low-hanging fruit, because Donald Trump won, and he beat a female candidate. And so those are two of the big sort of similarities. But Republicans are not in as strong a position now as they were in 2016. They have a much narrower majority in the House and the Senate. They are not looking at being able to hang on to their majorities in both houses by as much as they were in 2016. The 2018 map looked much worse for Democrats in the Senate than the 2026 map looks. It's not great, but Democrats have a lot more pickup opportunities in 2026 than they did in 2018. So all of that, and the Republicans have a much narrower majority now in the House, as I mentioned. And so we can expect legislatively they're not in as good a position as they were in 2016, but they did win comfortably. And so I think Biden was able to win in 2020 because Trump was the incumbent. And the thing about it is Donald Trump is really only popular when he's not in office. When he is in office, his approval rating is terrible. It's really, really bad because people see how he actually governs. He's bumbling, grossly incompetent. He doesn't really know what he's doing on a day-to-day basis. He's clearly someone so unfit for the job that it becomes super obvious when he's actually in elected office. That was the opposite of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was always very popular in office and always deeply, deeply unpopular out of office. When she was Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton's favorables were nowhere close to when they were when she left and the email thing happened and her campaign happened. And so she had the opposite problem as Donald Trump. And that really, that was a real killer. She was only a few points more popular than he was. Now, in this election, Kamala Harris was more popular than Hillary Clinton was in 2016 when you judge her favorables. And I think the campaigns were fundamentally different. Kamala Harris did run a very moderate campaign, but she still ran on economically progressive, somewhat broadly left of center policies like banning corporate price gouging and, the child tax credit. Hillary Clinton didn't run on any of that stuff. In 2016, her campaign was a giant middle finger to the left, to Bernie Sanders. She had she was very scoldy, very, very, very not. It was very, very not cut out for that moment, right? She ran as if she had no primary opposition. And so I think they ran very different campaigns. But I think the mistake they both made was going overboard and trying to court Republican voters. Hillary Clinton did this in 2016. We just don't remember it as well. But many Republicans endorsed her in 2016 because they couldn't stand Donald Trump. And Hillary Clinton made that a corner of her campaign. She attacked Donald Trump on character, not on policy, but on character. The Harris campaign, to show you how much the political situation has evolved in 8 years, actually did run against Donald Trump's economic policies. But they capitulated far too much on his policies on immigration. They moved way to the right than when they were even in 2016. And they weren't really progressive then either. Obama deported more people than Donald Trump did. But they were at least liberal somewhat on immigration. This time they weren't even that. They were pretty center-right on immigration because that's where most of the country is now. The country is yanked to the right on immigration the past 8 years in the era of Donald Trump. But that also, I think, demoralized a lot of their younger supporters who are in our generation, you and I, Nico, who are more concerned with matters of justice and more matters of a broader view of justice, social justice, not just for American citizens, but human justice for everybody, human rights for everybody, not moving beyond the civil rights sort of conversation and more broadly speaking about human rights. I think that demoralized a lot of the core base of the Democratic Party. And I think that was also a factor. Now, I'm going to have a hot take here in that I think that the wider consensus that inflation ultimately cost Kamala Harris the election is true. I think that people are paying way too much for groceries and housing. I think people are really struggling to make ends meet. And I think people have been struggling for a very long time, since the 2008 financial crisis. And I believe that if inflation had been less severe, Kamala Harris could have won the election. But I think because it hit people's pocketbooks so hard, it gave people who may have voted for Biden in 2020, those voters who decide the election, I think it really gave them sort of a Democrat got elected, my bills went up, I guess I'll just vote for Trump. I was better off when he was president. Now, that better off has huge caveats. Donald Trump did not do any policies that made anybody better off except extremely rich people. The people who were doing better off were doing better off because Obama's presidency saw a dramatic recovery from 2008. But even that recovery left people behind. So it's a very nuanced, complicated picture. But what failed Hillary Clinton was hubris and arrogance. This is not a campaign that ran as if they could possibly lose to Donald Trump. The Harris campaign viewed Donald Trump as a possible winner the whole way through, as the most likely outcome. Kamala Harris always said that she was the underdog in the race. And they're polling back that up. Their campaign believed that they hoped, of course, that what happened in 2020 would happen again. But in 2024, they were the underdogs. They behaved like the underdogs. How they reacted to being the underdogs, I think, cost them the election. And obviously Gaza and Palestine. I mean, most voters didn't rank Palestine as a major issue. And Americans typically don't care about foreign policy. Like, just broadly speaking, most Americans do not care. Most Americans see things happening abroad and they go, oh no, how sad. But there's no sense of moral obligation for what our tax dollars that are funding a genocide in Palestine. There's no sense of moral responsibility that our money is still paying for a Saudi Arabian genocide in Yemen. Like, there's just none of that. Americans typically view foreign policy as an over there issue. They view their pocketbook as an over here issue. And so Gaza has obviously infuriated us as people on the left, as people who love human beings, people who have humanity. But I don't believe that played as big of a role in Kamala Harris's loss as perhaps it should have. I think most Americans were really just voting on economic issues. And because Donald Trump had been out of office for 4 years, people were able to sanitize him just enough to justify voting for him again.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I agree that I don't think I think that that Palestine played a role in the sense that it was one of the many things that painted Biden as kind of like an incompetent leader. I think, you saw his record, obviously economic record. Many people, viewed him as, a poor manager of the economy. Obviously just like his personal conduct in terms of like coming off as like an old man who doesn't really know what's going on, obviously played a role. And that's why he dropped out. And then I think, both Ukraine and Palestine, kind of just, Trump very easily was able to paint the narrative of, oh, you had a bunch of wars going on after I left office, right? Even if that he, in fact, contributed very much to the, I think, you can make a strong case that the Abraham Accords and the way that Trump's, foreign policy played a role very much incentivized the exact conflict we're seeing today. Anyway, that's a whole nother story, but that's a strong narrative on foreign policy, even if it's not something people really care about that much. You saw in polling that Trump was the favorite candidate on Palestine, on foreign policy more broadly, and I think it's because of that. So that's definitely something that could have been prevented to some extent with an actual humanitarian approach. And
100%.
Yeah, and I agree with you in terms of just like economic and inflation being a big part of it. I think that that's kind of an interesting thing to look at, just from the sense that like Harris did have policies that were targeted to that. But I think the widespread perception was not really that Harris was going to tackle price gouging or anything like that. It was that she was part of the Biden administration.
Yes.
And it would have taken a lot more effort to ever change that perception.
Yes. 100%.
which is not something the campaign seemed particularly interested in doing.
Well, no, they didn't. Harris didn't distance herself from her boss.
I've called for an end to the war in Vietnam. I've pledged that within 90 days of my inauguration, I would have all the prisoners of war and all of our armed forces out of Vietnam. Since my return to the Senate, I have voted for every Senate resolution designed to end this tragic war.
In 1968, Nixon had a 20-something point lead over Hubert Humphrey after the Democratic Convention, which was a disaster for the Democrats. And it was a disaster because the Chicago police are fascist, and were horribly there was a lot of proof of that fact at the convention. Daley sicked the police on these peaceful young people and brutally, and treated them horribly, and violated all kinds of civil rights. But all Americans saw that. They saw a huge foreign policy fight in the Democratic Party, a dysfunctional party, a leaderless party without Lyndon B. Johnson, and a party that nominated a vice president totally in a back room. Hubert Humphrey had not run for the Democratic nomination that year. They just picked him. RFK had gotten shot. It was a mess. Nixon goes to Chicago after the convention, has a massive rally. He's ahead 20 points. And what is stopping Hubert Humphrey? He's tied so closely to Lyndon Johnson, who has a horribly low approval rating, who is not popular, who young people cannot stand because of his policy in Vietnam, his escalation, which is killing thousands of American soldiers, but killing thousands more civilians in Vietnam to prop up a very corrupt, imperialist South Vietnamese government. Humphrey makes a decision. I have to distance myself from LBJ. I have no choice. I'm morally obligated to do so because what I'm seeing in Vietnam bothers my conscience. Hubert Humphrey was a very moral man, a man very in tune with how his morality played a role in his politics. He was way ahead of the curve on civil rights. He was way ahead of the curve on police brutality. He was way ahead of the curve on so many issues, but in Vietnam, he was tight-lipped or he supported Johnson. His advisors say, Humphrey, if you give that Vice President Humphrey, if you give that speech, it's over. Like, we're going to lose the election. You cannot distance yourself from even as unpopular as Johnson is, we will lose the party if we distance ourselves from Johnson. But Humphrey says, nope, I'm going to do it anyway. He gives the speech, famous speech, distancing himself from Lyndon Johnson's policy, saying, I want the war to end now. I want to bring the troops home. I want the war to end now. The race, within weeks, the gap is closing. Humphrey is within a couple points of Nixon. Now, that's in an environment where Vietnam was a huge issue, wall-to-wall coverage. And the general consensus was Vietnam is a disaster. Even the Republicans campaigned against Vietnam that year. Nixon campaigned on peace with honor, is what he said. All the candidates, except George Wallace, were against Vietnam. This was not that. There is not a widespread consensus in America that we should cut off Israel. Some polling, when you ask very specific questions, should we do an arms embargo? Have we given Israel too much or too little support? The polling is contradictory. But the movement that made Vietnam the defining factor of Johnson's end of that term after he won in 1964 didn't quite happen with Joe Biden as significantly. The Democratic Convention went very well in 2024. Obviously, you had a huge, point of moral cowardice from the Democrats who refused to even have a Palestinian speaker at the convention. The Democratic Party has totally abdicated its moral responsibility in Gaza, but it's about a 50-50 issue in the Democratic Party. Half the party's pro-Israel, half the party's pro-Palestine. In the Republican Party, there are no pro-Palestine supporters there. None. That was not Vietnam. There was a prominent anti-war coalition in both parties. And by the time the 1968 convention rolls around, the only people who are really standing against the anti-war movement in the Democratic Party are the entrenched party establishment in the delegates. But even then, they end up selecting Humphrey. Humphrey ends up moving left on Vietnam. Kamala Harris did not do what Hubert Humphrey did. She just didn't. She didn't do the morally right thing because in her mind, and this was backed up by a lot of the polling, most Americans weren't all that concerned about Palestine. Young people are, but most Americans weren't. I think that tells us something, not just about Donald Trump's victory, not just about the fact that he's an agent and a profiteer of chaos, not just that when the Democratic Party fails, the Democratic Party commits moral atrocity and totally abdicate their high ground against him, like they did in Palestine, that it benefits him. But I think that this was not a Democratic Party that did the right thing and listened to its base of support, as it did in 1968, and made that election rather close. Now, I'm not saying that in this election, now obviously there's no American troops in Palestine, in Gaza. There's no troops abroad over there. It's very, very different. What made Vietnam really unpopular wasn't just that we were committing atrocities over there, but also that there were thousands of American boys being sent there every single day to fight in Vietnam and die. That's not happening in Gaza. But I think that for the base of the party, for the young people who the Democrats need to win, it was a number one issue. And it should have been. It was right to be. And the party didn't listen to us this time.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting comparison. I heard people talk about that before, and I agree with, your assessment that, that Harris failed to kind of live up to that legacy, definitely. So I think we've done a pretty good job of answering a lot of the questions I wanted to start off with. There's one thing I guess I wanted to circle back to a little bit, just in terms of centering things a little bit on the Midwest, which I kind of knew that it was not possible to really stay focused there. But what do you think that the vice presidential picks, both of whom were from states in the Midwest, played in this election, and what do you think that says about the state of politics today?
I really don't think they played much of a role. Mm-hmm. Tim Walz is one of the most progressive governors in the country. Him and J.B. Pritzker are two of the most progressive in the country in terms of policy. Gretchen Whitmer is one of them. I'd say probably those three. And Tony Evers is pretty progressive, but in terms of accomplishment, because Evers has a Republican majority in both houses because of gerrymandering. In Minnesota, in Michigan, in Illinois, you have Democratic trifectas. Those Democratic governors got a lot done in terms of progressive priorities. They're not necessarily Bernie Sanders Democrats, but they are, I think it's fair to say they're probably Sherrod Brown Democrats. Yeah, I think that the VP picks, I'll say this, I think they should have played a bigger role. Tim Walz should have been the progressive whisperer. If you're a Democratic nominee and you don't want to be a Bernie Sanders, and you don't want to be an AOC, you don't want to be a left candidate, which would be freaking awesome if we had an actually left candidate in the Democratic Party. I mean, come on. But if you don't want to do that, if you want to be boring and left of center and, be moderate while your running mate is more progressive than you to unite the party or whatever bullshit, you got to let him do that job. And the campaign totally muzzled Tim Walz. Tim Walz was so funny, so engaging, charismatic, relatable. He represents way more of the Midwest than fucking J.D. Vance. And the campaign just didn't let him say what he wanted to say. The party is so consultant driven that they refuse to let this guy just go off the cliff. Tim Walz does not do well when he's overcoached and overprepped. He said that in public. That's why he didn't do land a knockout punch at the VP debate. When he's prepped, he's scripted, he's not himself. He's authentic. In the same way that people like that in the Midwest, in Michigan and Wisconsin, where you have a lot of white working class voters, they like that about Donald Trump. Why couldn't we have it in Tim Walz? And so I would have liked the VP roles to have been better, but I don't think they played a huge role. Kamala Harris did not do very well in Minnesota. But I think that in terms of the future of the party, I really worry, and I hope this worry proves to be incorrect. I worry that people are going to overblame Tim Walz for Kamala losing and that she should have picked Josh Shapiro. I hope people aren't silly enough to think that if Shapiro was on the ticket, they could have won. She would not have. But she might have won Pennsylvania. but that wasn't anywhere near enough. Donald Trump got 316 electoral votes? Yeah, Pennsylvania would not have saved that. But I worry that they're going to blame Tim Walz, and that brand of politics is going to be blamed as well. Because even though Tim Walz isn't a Bernie, he's associated loosely with that wing of the party. And I worry that the Democrats will use that as an excuse to go further to the right, even than they already have. And they've capitulated on so many issues to the right that they will go even further. I think J.D. Vance had the potential to be a disaster for Donald Trump. And the only reason he wasn't is because, not just inflation, of course, but because Kamala Harris didn't distance herself from her boss. But I think that had she done so, and had J.D. Vance become a bigger issue in this election, that would have hurt Trump. Because J.D. Vance is so off-putting and so weird and has very, views that are way out of touch with how most people view women and gender and all, and because he's endorsed a national abortion ban. A lot of different things, but I would have hoped that the VP candidates would play a bigger role than they did.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I feel like the only time Tim Walz did his progressive whispering was like going on Twitch with AOC one time. And then other than that, they kind of just had him not doing a whole lot, not really talking about the things he was good at talking about before they picked him. And I think J.D. Vance could have been more important in a sense that the Democrats could have like attacked him more and kind of at the very least say, J.D. Vance was like, what an investment firm guy or whatever, like, Peter Thiel associate, but he's like this very rich guy. And so is Trump. And you could very easily attack both of them as being, representative of the elite in some way. And then also play all the insane, weird clips of J.D. Vance saying deranged things on weird podcasts all the time. Right. So I think that could have been a much stronger line of attack. And, that was not. They decided that instead Tim Walz should go say, I actually agree with you, JD, in the debate instead, which is what he ended up doing, basically.
Oh, my God, which is the worst of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party loves to say, oh, Republicans are not that bad. No, they are. They actually are really that bad.
Yeah. And I think that if you don't highlight how bad they are, you're going to lose a lot of your base who cares about those things.
Yes.
And I honestly, I do think that, there is some electoral, success you can get from courting moderate Republicans. But at the end of the day, most Republicans are going to vote for the Republican. Yeah. And you have a lot more other people you can draw in. So
you got to secure the base. And the base is progressive. Medicare for All should have been the Democratic Party platform on health care 10 years ago. The logical progression from the Affordable Care Act, if you liked that bill, which I did not. It did not go anywhere near far enough. But say you liked it. Right? Say, you thought that was the best we could do at that time. It wasn't. But let's say you did. The next step is universal health care.
Yeah. They didn't even run on the public option this time.
They didn't. They have totally abandoned that. Biden didn't do anything in the public option. He could have easily passed in the American Rescue Plan. The public option, Kyrsten Sinema said she would support the public option when she ran in 2018. That was just cowardice. Total cowardice. A total lack of ambition and a total lack of accountability to the progressive young base of the party.
And the pandemic would have given a perfect rationale for making healthcare such a focus, which I think in campaigning Biden did a little bit, but not in actual policy.
Not in government. He expanded the Affordable Care Act subsidies, which is good. It helps more people. But and the cap on insulin, that was a big thing. $35 cap. I mean, that's probably, I wouldn't say that's his best policy, but it's one of the best ones. I think his best is the National Labor Relations Board picks and Lena Khan and the Federal Trade Commission. On workers' rights, Biden has actually been pretty good. But in terms of health care, it's been lackluster. The party no longer even seems to ascribe or even aspire to universal health care anymore. And that is a total indictment on the PMC shift. Because most suburbanites don't want to pay more taxes to pay for health care.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, I think most suburbanites would still probably be much better off under a single payer system.
1,000%, yes.
But they probably have decent healthcare plans from work and don't really think about it too much. So
yes, absolutely. It's a class thing.
We're taking on very powerful forces who are concerned about one thing and one thing alone, and that is they want more and more wealth for themselves and more power over the economic system and the political system.
Okay, so getting back into it a little bit, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, outside of the presidential race, what other kind of electoral outcomes do you think were important to look at for this election?
Well, we got a lot of abortion protections in Missouri. It passed, which is a big deal. Missouri also voted to raise the minimum wage. That was a big deal. I'm not sure. I should have looked this up before this interview. I'm not sure if the Illinois amendment to raise taxes on the wealthy passed, but I would hope that it did because they need to be taxed more, especially in Illinois. We have one of the worst, most regressive taxation systems in the country. And we refuse to tax more of the rich. If we tax more of the wealthy in our state income tax, we have to tax more of the poor. Like that's in our Constitution as a flat tax. And so there was an amendment there. I think that there was a lot of positive things that came in some local races. I know DSA gained a few more state legislators in various states, Georgia and New York come to mind.
I looked it up. It looks like that Illinois referendum did pass. It was just advisory, it seems like, so isn't going to lead to any taxation changes. My guess is I don't know if that exactly what will happen. If
it's possible the General Assembly. Yeah, it's possible that the General Assembly passes it.
I thought that had to go through the Constitution, but it's the whole fair tax thing. But who knows?
No. So those types of things don't have to go through it. That the income tax does.
Right. Oh, okay. Because if it's property or
this would have been
a
property tax increase on wealthy property owners
that makes sense.
To cut it for poor property owners. It was a redistributive policy. I think those are really significant. The Missouri thing fascinates me because I think it shows that progressive policies are very popular in isolation. I think another encouragement is that Tammy Baldwin got reelected in Wisconsin. Tammy Baldwin is not a Bernie Sanders, but she certainly is more progressive than most of her Senate colleagues. Very much pro-worker, very much pro-union. And I think I hope the election results bear this out in terms of people voting for progressive priorities, that sort of pro-worker, when I think of wages, when I think of labor issues, I would hope that would signify that the Democratic Party is going to continue to embrace unions again, which they had stopped doing in the 90s and firmly stopped doing under Obama. Obama was not very good with unions. I would hope that would come back. But in terms of the political outcome in the Midwest, I think obviously Trump winning makes things a lot worse. But in terms of governors, we have 4 Democratic governors. If you think Pennsylvania's in the Midwest, okay. I won't fault you for that.
I'm not.
I don't consider them Midwestern, but I consider that the East Coast. But some people consider Pennsylvania part of the Midwest. Anyways, we got 4 solid Democratic governors, and I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on them in the next few years to put stuff firmly into law. Waltz, Evers, Whitmer, and Pritzker. Governor of Illinois has already signified that he's going to protect undocumented people. That the Illinois police will not cooperate with ICE to deport anybody. Very good. Very good. Democrats need to do more of that. In Michigan, They've already repealed right to work. I think they should just enshrine it into the Constitution if they have the votes to do so. I don't know if Whitmer does or not. But I think Whitmer should do the same thing. Police don't interact with ICE at all. Wisconsin got a fair map. Wisconsin got a Democratic majority Supreme Court. That's going to be really, really important. Really, 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 really important. Not just in terms of temporary redistricting of the legislature in Wisconsin, but also congressional redistricting come 2030 and 2031. That's not that far away from now. It's hard to believe we're already almost midway through the decade. But in terms of the next cycle of redistricting, that's going to be really, really important. But what I would encourage people to do in the Midwest is to get their hands dirty in any local organization, any local group that's doing any work at all. Doesn't have to be electoral. Electoral politics are one huge, important part of the equation, but they're not the only part. Join a union. Join the IWW. Join DSA. Join a group that is going to actively resist the right-wing bullshit, the barrage of insane shit that we're about to get from the Trump Vance administration. Know that there are more of us than them. At the end of the day, there are more of us than them.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely something that I think is a good place to end it on. A few more things I wanted to say. I'm not saying we have to cut it off here, but I think like that's definitely the sentiment I think that is the best takeaway from this election, because truthfully, you can look at, the result in whatever, you can pick like 5 states or counties or cities or whatever you want across the country and draw a million different conclusions from it if you want, just in terms of what is politically possible. But as you mentioned, there were, more populist, left-wing, pro-worker candidates, however you want to describe it, that did win. And that is a possible option for the Democratic Party. There's also plenty of, moderate other, candidates that outperformed, Harris, and other like examples you can point to. But there is enough of one in the, other that you can kind of take your pick about what conclusion you want to draw. And I think that the answer then is to go to what you actually believe in. And at the end of the day, I think like, even Sherrod Brown, who lost in Ohio, he overperformed Harris by like 7 points.
Yeah, significantly.
And, Ohio had pretty bad results. The redistricting failed. The Republicans basically won everything. But I think that is a path to success in a lot of places. And I think that any hope for like progressive change through the Democratic Party is going to need to, rely on those kind of elements within it, and not the moderates that may have also been able to outperform Harris, but mostly probably just because in both cases, because they're distant enough from the Biden administration to kind of position themselves more as outsiders, whether it's in a, pro-working class populist way, or it's in a, I'm basically a Republican way. They're able to do
Brown
that.
is in the former category, and he did better than a lot of moderates in Ohio have done. I mean, Nan Whaley ran 2 years ago and lost by 23 points, and even Tim Ryan lost by 8. So Tim Ryan,
his campaign is very weird, but
very, very mixed bag in terms of kind of populist, kind of not. He did worse in terms of losing. He lost by about 6 points. Brown was going to lose by about 4. Mm-hmm. And so if there's a special election to succeed J.D. Vance, I think Sherrod Brown can easily run and win. It'll be lower turnout. You'll get more higher engaged voters, which I didn't. Who knows
who he'll be running against too? Because
yes, if it's a normal Republican, he may have a hard time. But if it's a crazy person like Vivek Ramaswamy or something,
who knows?
Then we have no idea. That could easily be a toss-up.
Doge, which I'll have the honor of co-leading with Elon Musk, and as you may have heard, Elon and I are going to start a separate track of Dogecasts.
After he's done fighting to eliminate as much of the federal government as possible, maybe he'll jump over to Ohio Senate race. We'll see.
I hope I don't regret saying this, Nico, but I don't think the DOGE or whatever the hell it's called is going to actually do anything. I think that's just Donald Trump trying to get them out of his way.
I mean, it is an advisory committee that's report's going to take like a year or something to get done. And then, it's not like, the thing is, it's not like a novel idea to gut the bureaucracy. I mean, that's something the Republicans have wanted to do and have done a lot of under Bush, especially. But it's not like some crazy new thing. I mean, that doesn't mean that there won't be more of that under Trump. I think there certainly will be. But I do hope certainly that it's not like to apocalyptic levels that, Vivek has publicly said about like firing 75% of public employees.
Yeah, that would be a cataclysmic.
I mean, that would just be incredibly unpopular and stupid of them to do as well.
Well, I'm going to make a socialist case as a good government socialist. I'm going to make a socialist case for the bureaucracy.
Well, I love the bureaucracy, so this is the perfect audience for this.
Oh, great. Perfect. Here's the thing. The bureaucracy are not like these overpaid rich people. They're getting paid so much money because, well, some are overpaid rich people.
Yeah, at the top of the bureaucracy.
At the top of the chain, they're getting paid a lot, way more than they are actually doing. But normal people who work for the bureaucracy are getting paid adjusted to the income of where they live. And there are people who work for the bureaucracy who don't live anywhere close to D.C. There are millions of federal workers. Do you know most of them are people of color? The reason why the black middle class in Chicago was born is because of public sector jobs. The private sector did not hire black people. It was Jim Crow in Chicago, de facto Jim Crow. There was no hiring of black people in the private sector A black lawyer could not get hired at a white firm, but they could work for the city's law department under, whether it was under a patronage system, which wasn't a great system, or whether it was some other way. My grandmother worked for the county for 29 years. And my aunt has worked in a public service job, worked as a probation officer for 20-something years. My uncle, her husband, was a police officer. Obviously in favor of defunding and abolishing the police, but my uncle
it
was
fits your point, yeah.
And a security guard at a high, right? So there's so many public service workers in my family personally, and that's the story of so many black families. That is how the black middle class was able to become middle class. Because in the public sector, you got guaranteed a pension, you got paid decently, there was no real risk of your pay ever getting cut. If you stayed on and you developed skills on the job, you got promoted, or you got job security, way more job security in the public sector than the private. And so when we talk about the bureaucracy, when right-wingers rave against the bureaucracy, when neoliberal Democrats in cities who love to do this, they love to get neoliberal Democrats in big cities, love to come into office and cut, slash, and burn, lay off tons of people. They're laying off 50-something-year-old black aunties and uncles and grandmas who that's their path to the middle class. When they retire, that's how they can afford a home, to own their own home. Like that has been the path for so many. And so I would hope that the left would mobilize to defend those public service workers. And I'm thankful that we have so many public service unions, that public service workers are protected by unions, and that if they did pull some shit in the Trump administration or in these Democratic cities basically run by Republicans, that there should be massive strike action. Because, that's a death nail. That is a death nail to a huge, consistent line of alleviating some part of the racial wealth gap in America.
That's definitely an important angle to it. I think there's a lot of reasons to defend public sector jobs. That's all very valid reasons to do so. And I also think that from like a capitalist perspective or from a Marxist perspective, why capitalists would want to preserve some level of bureaucracy is that I think it's just going to plunge the country into chaos, right? I don't think it's going to be, the regulations exist partially to preserve capitalism from totally falling off the wheels, which no capitalist really should want to do. Obviously, there are some who do. But I think that, the exact way in which that unfolds is kind of yet to be seen. And I think I have some optimism that, like, I certainly hope I'm right, but I could be wrong, that even though the Trump administration is definitely going to do a lot of horrible and evil and stupid things, that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are probably not going to give, the keys to the country as much as they might want. But we'll have to see. It's kind of all based on a whim of one really stupid guy. So
yeah, somebody who's
hard to say, hard to predict, which is why this is it's like a weirdly exciting time in the sense that the left is mobilizing, but it's also a very scary time in the sense that we really don't know what we're mobilizing against in specific terms, at least. I guess mass deportations, but
that's one thing we know is going to happen.
That's the main thing we know is going to happen, and there's definitely ways to actions to take to get prepared for that. But I think we got some good stuff here. Is there any closing message you want to leave folks?
Stay hopeful, and don't give in to despair. Get off Twitter. I should take my own advice on that one. Stop doom scrolling and getting sad and depressed.
I don't get sad from scrolling.
I'm happy you don't get sad and depressed. I'm speaking to the general public.
Yeah, I also follow like people I think are funny or amusing, and that helps bring some levity to my life. I don't know. I'm not trying to defend the algorithm of Twitter, obviously, but I personally, maybe this is just me defending my own addiction to being on Twitter and saying, oh, it's good for me actually. But I don't know. I don't find myself doom scrolling. I find myself
that's great.
Reading like a million different things that are happening, some of which are very frightening, but I'm also just like trying to gather information. At least that's how my brain thinks that, but I tell myself at least. So I don't know.
Well, I'm happy you have a good relationship with it. That's good. That's rare in my experience, right? But speaking broadly to your listeners, Don't despair.
I don't know how many of them are on Twitter. I mean, probably a fair amount of them, but we'll see. Who knows? Who knows?
Well, maybe they're just despairing in general because the world sucks.
Yes, it's easy. I agree. I think that's a good closing message, is that, you know, as much as things are bad right now, I think the only way to ever change that is to have hope in a better future and to like fight for it. And I think that's very much within the spirit of this podcast. And I think a good message to take from this election, 100%. Which is that, you know, in order to stop for this, we need to fight for something better. And that that's the only way to stop this.
I tell people all the time, I'm a DSA member of other socialist organizations, board of directors of Institute for Christian Socialism. I'm not speaking for either of them when I say this, but I tell people we're the only choice.
Mm-hmm.
We either get a just future or there is no future. Mm-hmm. We just get constant repetitions of the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
Learning and labor. Station WILL has carried a special program this week giving information about the University of Illinois. If you have been a listener to these broadcasts, you have heard more or less about what the university does, how it does it, and what it hopes to do. Thank you, Dr. Willard.